Welcome to my illustrious panel. We are certainly going to be discussing something very critical, which is risk appetite and how it's changing. So I have a great panel that will be discussing this. And first, I'll just introduce everybody very quickly. So we have Khalid here, who's head of wholesale banking from the Gulf Bank. Maria, Secretary of Mining for the great country of Argentina. Chu, former Minister for Trade and Energy from South Korea. Bert, CEO of Cora Gold, operating in Mali, and Ed, a financial advisor, capital formation person from New York. So it's really good. So let me just frame up some comments and we'll go around and start having a discussion. So the industry really actually faces quite a basket of risks, from resource nationalism, where countries really want to extract more and more rent from their resource endowment, environmental, supply risk, and social community risks. And these, of course, ebb and flow in ways both by jurisdiction, by commodity, and they change over time. So it's not a linear situation that we're facing. So, to get this right is really important if the mining industry is to deliver an affordable, adequate, and secure supply of minerals for the just energy transition. And more importantly is how then the value from that mining flows to build prosperity for communities and countries. So what I'll do is I'm just going to go around and ask each person. So I'm actually going to start randomly with Bert. You're operating in Mali, and obviously every country has its jurisdictional risks, so we're not picking on anyone in particular. And particularly how you balance those jurisdictional risks, particularly with ESG goals and your own financial returns. So really interested, just Bert, getting a perspective, and you're developing the mine, so be interested to get your kind of insights and experiences in Mali.
Sure, thank you very much. I think firstly I'd say it's non-negotiable. I don't think there's any way you can use country risk as an excuse not to be fully engaged in ESG.
Yep.
I guess the second point I'll probably make on that is I think actually having a good ESG as a company actually is going to mitigate against country risk. I think actually being a good corporate operator reduces your country risk in country. And I think you're talking a little bit around investors as well. I think, again, it's non-negotiable in my mind from an investor perspective. I can't go into a meeting and go, oh, well, the country risk means that I can't have a good quality ESG commitment as a business. So I think those 3 points initially. I guess moving on from that, I suppose more broadly around country risk for me, I guess I sort of put country risk maybe into sort of 2 silos. There's sort of the political side of the country risk and there's the security side of country risk. Obviously, it's much broader than that, clearly, but within those 2 areas, they're very different, and obviously there are different mechanisms you can put in place to mitigate against them to a degree. I think it's probably also important to say, for particularly a country like Mali where we operate, I think the perception is often very different to the reality. I've been living and working there for a number of years now. If you Google Mali, sadly, it doesn't always come up with a huge number of positive news stories straight away. But a lot of the issues in Mali around security are often 1,000 kilometers away from where the mines are operating. So in terms of the mining industry making a positive impact in Mali, very clearly there's a whole number of companies like ourselves who are looking to build a mine, operating mines in Mali, and obviously hopefully having a really positive impact on the communities and the environment in which they're working in, creating employment and everything else. So I think there's often a perception, which is a real thing for investors trying to invest in your business. But then there's a reality on the ground in terms of how you operate. So obviously it's all intrinsically linked, and that's obviously what's amazing about this industry and this sector. But I think for me, those would be my sort of key points around it.
Great, thanks, Ben. I think a point you raised there is really important, is that risks that may be perceived by investors and banks, etc., may be different to what's actually being experienced on the ground. So how do you kind of bridge those 2 worlds? Khalid, I want to go to you, Gulf Development Bank. How do we make sure from a risk perspective, and often we're talking about reduction in capital availability for mine development, particularly to juniors. So how do we make sure these risks aren't interpreted and just keep reducing availability of capital and or making capital too expensive for these projects?
So first of all, thank you very much. It's Gulf International Bank,
sorry.
No, don't worry about it. If you allow me to just step back for a second and go back to the bigger picture, at least for what we're discussing here is Saudi Arabia. Risk appetite for the mining sector in Saudi Arabia has increased. And over the last few years, the central bank data actually that we have shows that the mining and quarrying sector, financing towards mining and quarrying sector in Saudi Arabia has grown by 67% over the last 12 months. It outpaced what we also consider a very healthy growth in the total credit market of 15%. Okay. So that's a clear indication that the banking sector, at least in Saudi Arabia, is pivoting towards that sector and has identified that sector as a key growth market for us. And aligned with what we heard from their excellencies, the ministers, over the last 2 days, and that the distinguished guests across this forum, that this is a clear sector that is driving growth and diversification of the economy. Having said that, we look at the mining sector and we look at what is it contributing to the GDP right now. It's around 80 billion Saudi riyals as of the 2021 GDP, maybe 2.5% of that. The expectation and the outlook and the opportunity, I must say, is there for it to go to 260 billion Saudi riyals by 2030. The government has, over the last few years, refreshed the laws associated with that. His Excellency Minister Al-Falih yesterday highlighted that it is progressive. It's a progressive law that has been launched. It is up to the international standards, and it puts the right framework and structure for everybody in that ecosystem. That adds comfort not only to investors and to contractors and everyone in that value chain, but also to financiers like ourselves. I mean, that's a light answer to your question.
Good, yeah, no. I mean, it's great to see that in Saudi Arabia the funding is becoming more available and not less, because that may not be the experience in other parts of the world. Maria, going to Argentina. So obviously, you know, particularly in countries too, risk varies both at a national level and a provincial level, because you know, all countries aren't created equal. And I know the mining code in Argentina is very interesting and probably gives more certainty in the way it's been structured. So it'd be good to get your kind of insights in terms of how the mining code is structured in Argentina and how you think about risks, particularly in terms of attracting capital into Argentina.
Okay. I didn't hear so right, so that's why I used that. You know, it's very interesting because talking about risk, I think that legal certainty is very important. We know that legal certainty is very important for investors. And in that sense, you mentioned the mining code and the differences between the national and the provincial level, and that's something that sometimes is difficult to understand because we're a federal government and the provinces own the natural resources in their territories, and that seems very complicated, but it's not that complicated at the end because given that the governors can manage the natural resources, but the mining code that you mentioned is a single code that runs throughout the country. So the 23 provinces that we have can manage the natural resources, but according to a single law. So that makes things easier. And as you said, the mining code is somehow insulated from changes, and it's a very important law. But we also have the mining investment law that it's also a federal government, a federal level law that applies throughout the country. So you have two significant and key frameworks for mining in Argentina that runs throughout the country. One that says you how you have to manage the natural resources, the procedure, and the other one that gives incentives for the mining to develop. And I think that legal certainty is very important for investors. But another thing that's very important for investors and for mining is the political decision. Yeah. And that's something that we are trying to foster in Argentina. We have a political decision to develop mining. Mining is a key feature in Argentina, a key industry in Argentina. We think that mining can be part of the solutions for the problems, the economic problems that Argentina has now, and that's why we are trying to foster the investment. And one thing that I think that it's an example of this political decision, and regarding specifically lithium, is the creation of the lithium roundtable that three governors from Argentina created. Salta, Catamarca, and Jujuy, to give more incentives and legal certainty to the investments because they have coordinated policies there that are much more important for investors, I think, to have more legal certainty and predictability.
No, I think the whole certainty, and we'll get more into this whole certainty aspect, and particularly in the context of, you know, this, on the flip side, we see growing resource nationalism, which is, you know, countries trying to extract from Australia to Canada to Africa, extracting more rent and kind of tearing up existing agreements. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's good. Chu, heading to you now. South Korea
Yes.
is a major consumer of minerals as a global manufacturer. And I'm really interested in, as the ultimate end user of minerals, how you think about supply chain risk, and particularly after pre-COVID or post-COVID, as we're thinking about secure supply chains and shorter supply chains for minerals. So we're very interested in how I know you're the former minister, interesting how you and South Korea look at this situation.
Yes, thank you, Peter. We see the ongoing geopolitical tensions, especially the rivalry between the US and China, and the supply chain vulnerabilities surrounding critical materials and rare earth elements as a matter of survival for our strategic industries such as batteries, electric vehicles, renewables, and defense systems. In fact, we are sandwiched between critical mineral exporters that are becoming increasingly protectionist, and also the product consumers who want to localize production and shift sources of raw materials toward like-minded countries known as friendshoring. This increasing protectionism can be seen in rising resource nationalism and the strategic use of the critical materials for geopolitical advantage. And while increasing the production and friendshoring can be seen in the US Inflation Reduction Act that gives the tax credit of $7,500 to only EVs virtually made or sourced beyond a certain percentage of raw materials in the US and the US FTA partners. Our vulnerabilities to this supply and market risk is close to dangerous, especially given that we rely on a single country, China, for almost 60% of core battery materials. For example, we import more than 80% of lithium hydroxide and cobalt hydroxide, around 90% of natural graphites, and about 60% of sulfuric nickel from China. In response, the Korean government set securing a stable supply of core materials as our #1 priority for industrial security and policy. We took a whole of Korea rather than whole of government approach to mobilize all available resources from the private sector as well as the government. This is because we realize securing core materials requires an all-out efforts beyond just battery companies or one ministry. In this context, we created a public-private partnership called Battery Alliance. This Battery Alliance is comprised of battery companies and global OEM automakers, battery upstreams like anode, cathode, and precursor firms, and overseas mineral resources development and export credit agencies, as well as relevant government ministries. This alliance has been mapping core critical minerals supply chains in terms of reserves, production, trade, and logistics, and instituting an early warning system. This Battery Alliance also shares promising overseas mineral projects to jointly invest among batteries, battery upstreams, and refining firms, and also promote the participation of Korean refining firms in the processing of secured raw materials, especially in US FTA partners like Australia and Canada, and also neutral countries and Korea. And to effectively support these firms, the Korean government has been providing cheap long-term financing, as seen in the $3 billion overseas mineral development financing facility created in our export credit agencies. And we also offer very generous tax credits, environmental and regulatory support, and land support for domestically located the refining firms.
Sure.
Yeah.
Think-
And also we provide diplomatic support, such as strengthening economic, industrial, and ODA collaboration with mineral resource developing countries. Through these incentives, the government intends to diversify sources of key raw materials and localize and reshore refining as much as possible, and also increases strategic stockpiling of core critical minerals such as cobalt, nickel, lithium, through the increase of government budget and tariff exemptions and financial support.
Thank you for that summary. And I think what you described, it's very interesting getting the perspective from the ultimate downstream user of minerals, because I think you describe a much more complex view of the supply chain than when we're upstream looking down. And you're describing a level of competition for minerals that's existing both at a country level and a company level.
Yes.
And that both adds risk and opportunity for money. So it's going to be interesting. So Ed, probably a good lead into you as we heard this complexity. I mean, you're obviously forming capital for mining projects. I've spoken to a lot of investors and they say capital's often scared about ESG blowback. Uncertainty because of the long-term nature of investments, 10, 20 years, price volatility, you add it up. This is why you get almost into a capital drought situation. So is it as dire as we're thinking, or is there light at the end of the tunnel?
I'll start with the end. There is light at the end of the tunnel, and I think it's the industry is going through a change. So if we continue to talk about critical minerals. If we were here 5, 10 years ago, we would not be talking about critical minerals. We'd be talking about minerals in general and mining in general around the world, which has been going on for centuries. The ESG push to move electricity or power to a battery focus has changed the nature of what we're looking at. So coming back to the drought of financing, if it wasn't for that, yes, it was shrinking year on year on year. And you start with, if you look at it, the mining industry makes up less than 1% of the S&P index. So from an institutional point of view to invest, they don't need to. Yeah. Okay. It does not impact their returns. The number of companies, I mean, I think if you add up all the mining companies, it'd be less than Google. Yep. So you don't need to, from an investment point of view, you don't need to be there necessarily. The point that's changing, which is extremely relevant, and we're seeing it from a country level in Saudi Arabia here, we're seeing it from a strategic importance to countries in terms of their infrastructure. You're seeing it in the United States. And part of that goes to the comments made earlier about China at the moment processes roughly 80% of battery materials. They don't mine 80%, they process. Correct. And so what you will see as these battery gigafactories are built around the world, which hasn't happened previously, mining is separated from the midstream and downstream historically. Steel companies separated from mining companies, BHP, others, et cetera. You're now going to see these things come back together again because it's going to be very important that the processing gets done, and that needs to be in country near battery factories. They can't be continuous shipping pieces of this around the world. That becomes impractical. And so the financing is going to change from where we historically have gotten it, most of it, I'd say, from institutions around the world. They're going to strategically change. So if you look at the last 6 months, the number of deals that have been done by OEMs and others directly with mining companies has never been seen before. If you talk to those OEMs 5 years ago, they never thought they had a supply problem.
Yes.
They are now starting, I don't want to say panic, but they're starting to realize, coming back to your point also, mining projects are not like oil and gas projects that you can get up and running within a year. It's a 5, 10, 15-year process, and it's a lot longer to do that. If you look at what the automotive industry, and by the way, everybody continues to talk about the automotive industry. When we get stationary batteries that can store power, they are 10 times the size of a battery in a car. So the materials that will be needed for that exponentially goes up. So you're seeing infrastructure change and the capital structure change in the deck of who's coming in. Debt was looking at the hardest piece. It will be equity that will be the hardest piece.
Okay.
That will be provided by governments, by OEMs and others, whether it's offtakes and other pieces of paper that they will put into those structures. And then it will come back to the equity piece and how they get that done. The largest private equity fund in mining is only $8 billion large. That shows you how small the industry really is in terms of capital deployment. That has to change, and it is slowly changing, and it's got to increase. The velocity of that has to increase. It will increase. Groups like ourselves are finding those pockets and trying to work with them. If you look at most of the metals outside of copper and nickel, they're all called minor metals for a reason. Not one of the major mining companies are involved in any of the minor metals outside of Glencore through cobalt, which is a byproduct of their copper. But outside of that, there is no major mining company. And that also has to change, and people are going to have to figure out how to build these infrastructure around that quicker. Otherwise, we're going to have other problems. And then the last piece on what you were saying, we have to find a way. So the same people who are asking for batteries are also the ones stopping the mines from being built. That has to change. So we, as a group, have to become better stewards of that capital on an ESG basis, that mining is not the pariah that the industry outside thinks that it is, and that we can act as good citizens at the same time, because otherwise we don't get the batteries.
Yeah.
I think people forget that those materials come out of the ground. And by the way, wind and solar is the same thing.
Yeah.
All the materials for wind and solar come out of the ground. So we have to find a way that we can work together with those environmental groups to let these things happen. And the longer they hold it up, the harder it becomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great point, is even if within the sector we are minimizing risk in every way at a country level, project level, there's still this overhang of societal perception of mining is very negative, and that drives kind of risk perception of the industry as well. Mira, I'm going to back to you. What is a country's role in what we're talking about? So does Argentina think about, yes, I'll give companies certainty, but will you go beyond that, downstream, provide capital to get these projects to happen? Because it's in your interests that resources are developed faster, and maybe you can't rely on companies and private markets. Do you have a point of view on that?
For the projects to develop faster, yeah, I think you mentioned downstream, so there are two things. Of course, that we want the projects to develop faster because we know it's a window of opportunity that we have now, especially with lithium. And the way to do that, I think, it's having an open conversation with the projects, with not only the companies that own the projects, but also with the communities, because we need the communities to understand what he was saying, that this is very important for the future and for the energy transition, but we also need to have the social license and people noticing and having a sense of the importance of mining and really having them happy with the development of mining in their community, sensing that change that it makes. That I think that's important for the mining developments to go faster. But also in terms of downstream, it's something that's very important for the country. And of course that we want to be part of that. Everyone wants to be part of that. But Argentina has the lithium, and it makes sense. It doesn't make sense to shift the raw materials all around the world if you want to have a green world, because the carbon footprint is increasing with that. So it makes sense to have all the industry upstream, midstream, and downstream in the country. And in order to do so, I think that as a country, we don't only have to have this legal entity that we're trying to have and foster investment, local investment, we also have to have this transparency and great community conversation with the community and with all stakeholders. And the spaces for dialogue and fostering the investment are very important. But also I think that the government is trying to have a share and a participation in the development of mining through the local companies,
Yes.
as an extra player, right? So that's something that it's important, finding these alliances and trying to coordinate with not only the companies, but also local companies, private investors from outside, but also from the country.
Great, thank you, Maria. And my next question, Bert, I'm going to ask you first to answer it, and then Khalid, I'm going to give you an opportunity as well to lean in, and everyone else. And Maria, I'm going to leverage off something you said, which is communities, indigenous people. So on my non-profit board, we had Matthew Kuhn Kam, who was just, when he was there, the Grand Chief of the Cree Nation in Canada, sits on boards, previously Newmont, which he just left. But he made a statement, he said, Indigenous people find consultation insulting because we want participation. So the question first to you, Bert, is, more and more communities, Indigenous people, as they reframe what value looks like, actually want equity participation in mines, yet they often find it very difficult to find sources of funding to invest in companies, and they don't want 2%. That's not what they're talking about, because they're doing things on their land. So I'm interested, as a mining CEO, how you think about, how do you get equity participation for Indigenous people at a reasonable level, not kind of a token 1%.
Yeah, it's a tricky question, isn't it? And I think ultimately, as a mining company, you think you always want to do best by your communities, but equally, that isn't necessarily telling them what's best for them. Well, clearly, it's an open discussion, and there's a number of communities that all have different needs and wants and desires, and it's very hard to manage that situation clearly. Obviously, in a country like Mali, and obviously across much of Africa and globally, the government generally gets a free carried interest in your project. There's obviously taxes and royalties and other things. So obviously, hopefully that money should be getting recycled into the country to obviously be reinvested to help the whole country move forward. I suppose it's a very tricky one to answer on a specific basis around local investment, as you say. The local communities, hopefully you're providing, a future which might look brighter in terms of education, the opportunity to diversify in terms of jobs and roles and healthcare and everything else, but not necessarily everyone wants it. A lot of them might like their traditional way of life. They might actually find the fact that you're turning up to be, it's not what they want to see. So, it's a difficult one to answer exactly how you get local participation correctly factored. Obviously, everyone tries to do the best, and obviously it's always an evolving situation. But I think, particularly from an equity perspective, it's difficult, especially if at a national level the government is taking an equity position, to then also have on a local level an equity participation as well. And how do you define the project?
Yes.
You've got a license area, but ultimately communities aren't just in a specific place. So there's a huge number of factors which would need to be considered around that. And I don't know quite how you go about doing it on an equal basis.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. And, and there is no one size fits all in this situation, because every community is different, every situation is different. But Khalid, as a centerpiece of Future Mineral Forum and the whole platform is a very keen focus on prosperity for communities, which includes equity participation. So in your organization, are you thinking about that, how communities can participate financially in projects at an equity level?
Yeah, so I think the key is in investing in value chain, in the whole value chain. We saw this in the Ma'aden's aluminum project. It started with the beginning, and it goes down all the way to the cans that make the drinks that we have. Deepening the markets, investing in more companies, allowing more companies to come in. The Public Investment Fund is very keen on looking at this market sector. Okay. They establish companies regularly with the intention of eventually putting in and instilling in the right governance, and obviously listing it into the stock market and allowing the community to invest equity into that. The other thing is, as you invest in the value chain, And we heard from fellow panelists here as well that it's not only the upstream part of the business that's part of the value chain, there is also the downstream and the service providers and the whole ecosystem that's going to be part of that value chain and ecosystem. And when you start investing in that value chain, you create demand for those smaller companies and MSMEs in particular.
Yes.
The Ministry of Mining and Industry here has circulated a paper on how to enable the middle and micro and middle and small enterprises to benefit from that drive.
Yeah.
And we as a bank are aligned with that and would welcome receiving requests from that.
And I think the point there too is that this is an integral part of the Vision 2030. So you start with the vision, and then
And everything is
Yeah.
aligned. Everything you do in the country is aligned with the bigger and wider vision of diversifying the economy, improving the revenue base of the country, and allowing more employment for the country.
Yeah, no, that's good. Chu,
Yes.
I mean, we could talk about geopolitics all day long, I think, but isn't this kind of competition for resources that we're seeing? To me, it's kind of a zero-sum game, because at the end of the day, the whole of humanity needs to get to this, and I think maybe a major risk that I see come evolving is that this kind of competition for resources, both at a country level and even at a company level, could ultimately become a zero-sum game for humanity, and we could really tilt this in the wrong direction. So, a no surprise question. How do you think about that? Am I overreacting that this is a problem, or could we face a serious situation?
So, yes. Yeah, in order to avoid the competition for resources becomes a zero-sum game, I think we need to rely on technology.
Yes.
Technology can become a big disruptor.
Yep.
It can make the whole mining process more productive, more efficient, and more sustainable, while it can also disrupt the development of specific minerals. For example, the development of scarce materials, as in the case of Korea's LG Ensol, which is second largest battery company, of high nickel anodes.
Yes.
Yeah? And also, if we invest in technology, we may come up with alternative sources, alternative the devices, etc. That's precisely why the Korean government, together with the Korean firms, have been increasing in investment in technology for scarce material substitution and the technology substitution.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it's one thing to try to expand production as much as possible, but at the same time, since there's a demand, so I think there's also a great incentive to invest in R&D to develop alternative or materials.
Yeah. And increase recycling.
Yeah.
I think those are great points.
Then we can avoid these
risks.
Becomes the zero-sum game, and this will become a non-zero-sum game.
That's good. And I'm sure South Korea will be leading this. So we're counting down. So I'm going to ask, starting with you, Ed, 20 seconds each, one big takeaway that you'd like to leave the audience with from what we're talking about from a risk perspective, investment, etc. So 20 seconds, one takeaway, away you go. Ed.
I think, again, I think governments need to understand that they need to be involved in this process, because if you want to attract foreign capital, both on an equity and a debt level, there has to be some interaction that people understand, especially if you're opening up a country like Saudi Arabia as a new country, or Argentina obviously has had its issues in the world before. Those people who want to deploy capital have to have connectivity to the government, not only the project, to understand that they'll be protected and their capital will be protected in country.
Yep.
And I think that's a huge thing that that will leverage itself in a multiple way if they can do that.
No, thanks, Ed. Very important point, I think. Bert,
Yeah, I think regardless of country risk, a good commitment, a strong commitment to ESG is just non-negotiable from a mining company perspective. I think regardless of where you're operating, you've got to make that commitment and you've got to make sure you execute it to the best of your ability. And country risk is no excuse for not doing it correctly.
Cool, thank you. Chu.
It is important for mineral supplying countries to count in mineral consuming enterprises in developing inclusive supply chains. They are very much willing and very much incentivized to enter into strategic partnerships with mineral resources supplying firms as a long-term off-taker and investor.
Great, thank you.
And also recycling.
Very
Recycling of used batteries and other gadgets.
We often forget
would be,
that. Thank you.
Very,
Yes.
very.
Maria.
From a government's point of view, I think I would highlight the importance of coordinated policies, long-term policies in order to foster the development of the mining industry. Also transparency on, of course, the communication and the dialogue with all the stakeholders.
Cool, thank you. Yep. And Khalid, last word.
Thank you so much. From a financing point of view, we look at it as a very widespread opportunity. And I leave you with 4 S's: strategic, sensible, structured, and sustainable.
Thank you.
Those are the things that we look at.
No, they're very important. I think the centerpiece of much of what we've been talking about is collaboration, transparency, working together, but also increasing investment in technologies around recycling, substitution, and work more collectively together. And I think we'll reduce all the risks that we're facing, and hopefully create a better environment for both equity and debt investment. So actually we finished 25 seconds early. So again, thank you guys very much. Please join me in thanking this tremendous panel.